Good afternoon. Welcome to the last session of the 2020 Cambio de Colores webinar series. I'm Veronica Perez Picasso, the Cambio Center Coordinator. Today we will hear presentations that deal with political participation and policies on local, state, and national levels. Our moderator for today is Lisa Dorner, one of our Cambio Center board members, who will now present our speakers. Thank you, Lisa.
De nada. Good afternoon. It's great to see everybody here. I'm sure more people will be coming in over the next 2 minutes. I'm going to start with a couple announcements and then we'll get right to the conversation. So as Veronica said, my name is Lisa. I am an associate professor at the University of Missouri-Columbia and also a fellow and part of the board at the Cambio Center at Mizzou. And so I'm really glad that we were able to gather at least for a few different panels over Zoom this week, since we had to postpone our Cambio de Colores conference until next year. So I want to tell everyone first, please don't forget to consider registering and keeping your eye out for the call for abstracts. The conference next year is scheduled currently for June 16th through 19th, so very similar dates, 2021. So please mark that down. As for today, just so you all know, we will have videos of these different panel discussions that have happened over the past few days. So check the website next week. Those should be posted there. There'll be additional videos as well that should be posted there, I think, as early as today. And we also have the 2019 proceedings available. So for some of the folks who had abstracts and presentations that they were supposed to do during the conference that was in person, we're not able to hear from them today or this week, but we can actually go see the proceedings. And then, we encourage everyone to contact those authors directly, and you can get to know what they were about and learn something from them directly. So we are going to ask, you all know the Zoom routine, I think. It looks like everyone has figured it out. We're going to stay on mute unless we are talking, and I will do the same. And we also encourage everyone to please submit questions. Anytime you have them, go ahead and submit questions over the chat button. So I will try to help moderate and keep track of that. I think what we will do is have each presenter, though, give their 10 to 12 minute presentation, and then we'll have a conversation at the end. So we should have nearly 20 minutes or more, perhaps, for a conversation across the papers that we can have as a group. So I will do my best to moderate that, but feel free to throw up your question into the chat at any time you have it. So we do have 3 papers today. I'm going to go in order that they were listed in the postcard. We're going to start out with Cristián Doña-Reveco from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And he is going to talk to us today about Latino seniors in Omaha. So between silences and invisibility. I'm going to let him talk more about his biography as deeply as he wants to get. But I won't go further than say that he is an excellent colleague we have there in Nebraska, and we're so happy to hear from him today. So I'm going to turn it over and go on mute. And then after that, we'll go to our other 2 presenters.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. It's interesting times on how to present via this. I've been, obviously, as most of us have been teaching online, so I assume teaching using Zoom, so I assume that it will work out. If at some point anything disappears from your camera, from your screens, let me know. I'm going to share my my PowerPoint presentation that I have here, and that should be working right now. Right. So as Lisa was saying, my name is Cristián Doña-Reveco, and I'm the director of the Office of Latino and Latin Studies at UNOYAS. OYAS has a long trajectory in Nebraska. I came to be the director about 3 years ago. It's going to be 3 years in August. And part of the research line that I wanted to bring, or that I wanted to engage with, is on groups that I found that were fairly invisible, or at least were not usually talked about. So there is, I'll show, there's a strong research line on Latino seniors and aging Latinos, but it's mostly from health perspectives, right? So I wanted to go a little bit deeper into other things. So that's one of the reasons why we proposed this, we're talking with some of our partners in the community, the Intercultural Senior Center, who has a long trajectory in the city, being a day center for seniors, for Latinos originally, and now Latinos and refugees. And we got funding to do this research from the Omaha Community Foundation. And that's 100%. It's mostly a report, a technical report, a community report, more than an actual research article. So there's something that we're still trying to see how it works. And for me, what is important about this is that we still need to take this back to the community, take it back to the people. And only after that, I'll say, okay, it's ready to go out. But this is sort of a first preview of our results. So why should we study Latino seniors? Yes, everyone is talking about baby boomers getting older, and white non-Hispanic or non-Hispanic whites being the largest proportion of over 65 and older. I agree with that. There's no doubt in data about that. But by 2060, we know that Latinos are going to be more than a quarter of the U.S. population, with the largest growth of any minority. Okay. But when we look at the numbers of the over 55, over 50, and over 65, we have that, yes, Latinos have a larger growth in every single age group, but it is the largest growth in the over 65 age group. So Latinos are growing faster than any other group by any other age group in the nation. That's one thing, we know that. When we look at numbers, within the Latinos, those who are 65 and older are growing faster than any other age group between Latinos. So there's not a chance that we'll reach, by 2060, I'll be 85, hopefully. That when I get 85, there's not a chance that we'll be as many as non-Hispanic whites. But it is very likely that it's a large proportion of the population of the U.S. anyway. And there's a higher, at least in Latino women, Latino women have the higher group in the nation at this moment, right? So not only it's a larger proportion of Latinos, but they're living longer, right? And Latino men have the third largest higher life expectancy, only after non-Hispanic white women, right? So we're talking about a group of people that's going to live longer, at least in theory, or at least in data at this moment, than any other group. Because of that, there's a lot of research on health aspects, and that's fantastic. Alzheimer's, what kind of diseases they have, the health aspects, but there's some living arrangements, almost nothing on policy towards Latino seniors. There's some comparative analysis between Latinos and African Americans, Latinos and whites, but there's no research directly related to Latino seniors, at least that I could find. At the same time, there's a growing field of research on migration of seniors, both return migration and also migration when older. Classical idea on international migration is that most people that migrate do it between the ages of 18 and 50, right? We're seeing more and more that it's over 55, over 65-year-olds that are actually migrating as well. Some really interesting research on this from a very different perspective. Retirees from England that before Brexit used to go to Spain and to France. It's called lifestyle migration. But in the case of Latinos, we're seeing that there's at least return, or that there's some, once the children are in the U.S. in this case, and they have their own children, grandparents are brought over, right? They're brought to take care of the grandchildren, which is, how in many cases our communities are built. So that is a growing field as well. So not only we have Latinos in the U.S. that are getting older, we have a small, interesting influx of people over 50 and over 65 from Latin America migrating to the U.S. And this, at least in the Midwest, it has not been studied at the state or local level. Right? So those are the reasons why we started looking at this research. So we ask, are there policies for seniors broad enough to include aging Latinos? Very simple, right? Basically, are Latinos present in the policies? This is a highly vulnerable group. Not only we have people that don't speak English, we have people in poverty in larger proportions than other groups. We have, in the cases of Latinos that have been in the US longer, have been in the labor force, because of the kind of work they do, they tend to have more disability issues, even after 50. We'll talk a little bit about that in the conclusion. So it's a highly vulnerable group that we need to study. And as I was saying at the beginning, by silences, I mean groups that have not been dealt with enough. So in the case of Nebraska, we have political participation, education in youth, overall health, businesses, but aging Latinos is a group that we have not talked about. Other people within OYAS are working on Latinos and trafficking, for example. Right? That's something else that in Nebraska, that's something else that we have not talked about. My goal is that after a few years have different and mental health at least, and domestic violence as well. That is where I found the silences, at least in Nebraska. In the overall project, we used 4 data sources: the American Community Survey to categorize a policy research in Nebraska. We did 12 interviews with experts, mainly people working at the state, at this local and state level on organizations that work with seniors. And we did a case study of a local organization. Our partners in Cultural Senior Center, we basically went through and look at what kind of work and how the Latinos were attending, right? The first I'm going to talk about, so in Nebraska, there are increasing dependency ratio for Latinos over 65 and over 55 compared with any other groups. And interestingly enough, another project, maybe I found that there was a significant decrease for under 18 dependency ratios. So maybe we actually have a future demographic dividend here. And we can talk about at the end and how that will impact seniors. The 65 plus by ethnicity and race, 2010 to 2050. Very quickly, these are non-Hispanic over 55 and older. The increase of the line is very small. This is the lowest of every single one. And what is interesting is that we have the non-Hispanic whites age 65 and older, we have a larger increase, which is expected. But look at this. This is non-Hispanic blacks, 55 and older. This is Latinos, 55 and older, non-Hispanic blacks, 65 and older, and Latinos, 65 plus. The increment among Latinos is the highest of any group in both the 55 and older and the third most largest in the 65 and older. And here by 2050, the proportion of 65 and older non-Hispanic whites is going to be about the same as non-Hispanic blacks, age 55 and older. So we have that the proportions are actually getting to it. But that is a general overview of what's going to happen in the next 30 years. What about policy? There's a federal policy, the Older American Act from 1965 that was amended in 2016. There's no mention of any specific minority group. Only mentions minorities, as in general, and people with limited English proficiency. So there we have anyone from a refugee from Myanmar or a grandmother from Panama, right? That just arrived. So we have that difference. The only difference is that there's a specific funding for higher education institutions preparing Hispanic students for gerontological careers. There's that. That's the only time where Hispanics or Latinos are being mentioned. About state policies, there's a state unit on aging in Nebraska. And until 2019, there was no specific policy. October 1st, 2019, the unit came out with a plan for aging services for the state. And that still talks about minorities in general. No Latinos. No other minorities, by the way, but in our case, no Latinos. It argues that a majority speak English of the seniors, which is true because most of the seniors are non-Hispanic whites. So there's little need for language. But that is not recognizing that those who are below the poverty line are not as many non-Hispanic whites and other groups. So 93% of those above the poverty line or 65 are non-Hispanic whites. In the case of those below the poverty line, the group. It states, and this is a direct quote from the plan, that a key strategy is to identify the need to develop creative solutions that take into account racial, ethnic, and cultural differences. That's it. Nothing else. So why? Where are the problems? Some of our interviewees call them the invisible people. Right?
So
the Latino seniors are
two minutes left, so you know, 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I'll be done, hopefully. These are the invisible people, right? They have low proficiency in English, which is against what the state proposed in its plan. And also they most stay at home, right? So they're not visible directly, they're not out there. All minority populations are underserved. Latinos are not an exception to that, right? So it's, again, this is not a problem just for Latinos, right? I'm using Latinos because that's the group that I work with, right? But we see that all minorities are underserved. Seniors are underserved. So imagine, if seniors are underserved, imagine what happened with minorities in general. And that's problematic. But at the same time, my interviewees argue that there's more Latinos in need of service than what they're getting, but also there's more Latinos that are using the services. So it's increased number in Latinos that are using, but we know that they know that there's still more than actually need them. People that work on this with the community organizations argue that there is a lack of community awareness and a lack of trust on the system in general, right? Because the system is very predatory in the sense that the state's private companies, private companies are the ones who serve these populations, and they just go at them and try to get as many cases as possible. So there's a lack of trust on what the state can provide them. There's also increasing fear, right? While some of these Latinos are people have been living in the US for a long time and might be citizens already, we have this new group, this older seniors that are coming in that are not citizens. Some of them might be undocumented. And with the new immigration policies, that they're not attending senior services. There's cultural challenges as with everything. There's not understanding that minorities might require different approaches to aging services. And within the Latino community, it's good that we can talk about when we have one translator in Spanish, it might serve for all our countries or most of our countries. But at the same time, you're grouping people from the majority, in the case of Nebraska, of Mexico, with people from Central America, some of them who have indigenous origins and might not speak Spanish, and from South America in the least cases, but you have Colombians and Venezuelans and others that are culturally different. the groups. So that is the con of patternicity always. And partner, that is sort of agents that works with Latinos. Here, yes, they're not visible because there's not part of policy design at all, right? And because they're not part of policy design, or they're not part of actually the existing policies, they're not part of policy design in the future, at least in the near future, unless we start talking about them and unless we're actually saying, look, minorities, senior minorities have specific needs, and each group, each minority group has actually specific needs and need to address by policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. So please don't forget to post any questions you have in the chat button, and we will get back to that. But now I am very pleased to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So we're going to hear, the title of this next talk is Comparing Measures of Linked Fate, a Cross-Racial Analysis of Political Participation. And so I'm very happy to introduce to you Yoshira Macías Mejía. And I'm going to let her go into more depth in her biography, but she is a postdoctoral scholar from Michigan State University with the Julian Zamora Research Institute. So I'll turn it over to her. Thank you very much for your talk, Cristián. And now we'll move to Yoshira.
Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? I am just going to share this presentation now with you. So besides being a postdoctoral scholar at Michigan State University, I'm also a political scientist. And I study racial and ethnic politics, specifically Latino politics and public policy. So this paper started with an analysis, started with the inquiry of the salience of immigration policy in 2016. Specifically, I wanted to see how groups reacted to the anti-immigrant, anti-Latino rhetoric of 2016, given the attacks by the now President Trump, and given the availability, given that most research looks at the standard model of political participation, such as, do you have higher levels of socioeconomic status? Do you donate to a campaign and so forth? I wanted to expand on research regarding racial and ethnic identity and voting for our own collective interests of the group, which led to the following questions, being, does political participation vary by racial and ethnic group as a result of linked fate? And if Latinos were motivated to participate in politics on the basis of a new measure of linked fate, which is an immigrant-based linked fate, and how this compared to non-Latinos. So the theoretical framework driving the study is this whole concept of linked fate. So what is linked fate? Linked fate is a mechanism that's derived from group consciousness, and it posits that if you feel that your fate is linked to that of your own racial and ethnic group, that this will result in some sort of political cohesion within your own racial and ethnic group, which should then translate into you voting or participating in politics that benefit the entirety of the group and not just yourself. However, when including the immigrant-based linked fate measure, I theorize that given the current racialization of Latinos as immigrants, regardless of whether they're native born or foreign born, people see someone on the street, and if they have specific phenotypes or if they speak a specific language, it triggers them to think that they're not US citizens. So because of that, I argue that Latinos should have higher levels of immigrant-based linked fate, which should lead them to participate in politics because of that. However, I also argue that this should be more pronounced for Latinos than non-Latinos. This led to the following two hypotheses that I test out, which the first one is the linked fate hypothesis, which is that Latinos, Blacks, and Asians expressing higher levels of linked fate will be more likely to participate in politics than Latinos, Blacks, and Asians expressing lower levels of linked fate when controlling for other factors. The second hypothesis is the immigrant-based linked fate hypothesis, which is that immigrant-based linked fate will be higher among Latinos than among non-Latinos and should translate into higher levels of political participation for Latinos, but not non-Latinos. So what I do for this study is that I use the collaborative multiracial post-election survey from 2016 to test whether my hypotheses are accurate or not. So the dependent variable for the study is a 10-point, is a count variable from 0 to 10, which combines 10 measures of political activity. And it includes the validated vote measure, not the self-reported vote measure, meaning that individuals can report during the survey, oh yes, I voted, but there's a validation going on with voting records to see if the individual actually voted. So what you find with that validated vote measure is that actually 70% of the 92% of respondents that said that they voted actually voted. So it's a lot lower. Other measures included are donating to a campaign, attending a protest, signing a petition, and among others. That's just an example. Also, the independent variables would be the traditional measure of linked fate, which is 2 questions on linked fate used to construct the measure. Roughly, the first one is, do you think that what happens generally to people in this country will have something to do with what happens in your life? That's the first question, and it's just a yes or no. From there, the respondent gets asked, and will this affect you, and to what degree? From that, the values of that variable are 1, you don't have any linked fate, 2, not very much, 3, some, and 4, a lot. The second independent variable is immigrant-based linked fate, which is, this one isn't a 2-step question, it's just one question that asks, what happens generally to immigrants in this country will have something to do with what happened in your life. The values are the same as the previous one, it ranges from 1 to 4. And the correlation of both of these measures is 0.41, meaning that they're not really highly correlated with each other. Standard controls included in the model are socioeconomic status, education, income, employment, demographic variables, political orientations, political interests, national origin, and cultural factors are only included for Latinos and Asians. Political mobilization and then perceived as an immigrant is included for Latinos. So the descriptive data shows the following. When comparing the original measure of linked fate and the immigrant-based linked fate measure by race and ethnicity, you find that for Blacks, having a lot of linked fate is higher because there are 25% when compared to Latinos and Asians. When looking at the immigrant-based linked fate measure, you find that Latinos and Blacks who feel that they have a lot of immigrant-based linked fate are at the same percentage at 17%, which is very interesting comparing it to Asians, because I expected that Asians will also have some type of level of linked fate with immigrants, given that they have a large immigrant population within their ethnic group. So moreover, when looking at the multivariate analysis results for the first two models of Latinos, I used, instead of showing you the regression tables, I opted off for coefficient plot to make it easier to visualize. But what this says is that, what the analysis shows is that for Latinos, if you have higher levels of link fate, you're more likely to participate in politics than Latinos who have lower levels of link fate. The same goes for the immigrant link fate model, which shows that Latinos with higher levels of immigrant-based link fate are more likely to participate in politics than Latinos with lower levels of immigrant-based link fate. Among other controls or variables that also influence political participation for Latinos are voter mobilization, political interest, education. Employment is positive in the link fate model, but it's marginally significant when it comes to the immigrant-based link fate. And for both models, speaking Spanish decreases the probability of participating in politics. So based on these results, they both support my both of my hypotheses that link fate should increase political participation among Latinos, and that immigrant-based link fate should also increase political participation among Latinos. With regards to the predicted probabilities, to understand the magnitude of the original measure of link fate and the immigrant-based link fate, you see here in the graph that Latinos who do not have a lot of link fate are only 2.1% likely. There's a 2.1% likelihood in the probability that they will engage in politics, compared to roughly 3.5% of Latinos who will have a probability of participating in politics. So in other words, there's a good increase in how pronounced the original measure of link fate is for political participation among Latinos. For the immigrant-based link fate measure, the results show that for Latinos who do not have a lot of immigrant-based link fate, there's only the probability of them engaging in politics is 2%, when compared to Latinos who have a lot of link fate, where the probability of engaging in politics is only 3.3%. Now, it's a little bit lower than the original measure of link fate, but it still impacts their political participation.
So there's about 2 minutes left, just so you know.
Okay, I'll try to run through it as quickly as I can. So for the results for Asians, actually link fate and immigrant-based link fate do not result in an increase in political participation for the group. So this is surprising to me with regards to the immigrant-based link fate model, because given the large portion of immigrants in that ethnic group, I would have expected that it would matter for them. But some research suggests that it actually has to do with breaking them out through national origin to get different results. But for them, it was the biggest driver of political participation was political interest, and political participation was marginally significant. So for the Black models, or the results for Blacks, you find that link fate is only marginally significant in predicting political participation for this group, which is also surprising to me because Blacks tend to have higher levels of link fate and tend to be more likely to participate because of that. However, when you look at the immigrant-based link fate measure, it's statistically significant and positive for Blacks, and it actually propels them to vote more or participate in politics. Other results for them were that voter mobilization, increased political participation, political interest, and employment was marginal for both models. Again, when you look at the predicted probabilities for the Black model, when just looking at the original measure of linked fate and immigrant-based fate, you see that there's a good jump in the magnitude and in how pronounced both of these measures are for increasing political participation for Blacks. So what do I what's my takeaway from the results? Well, for one, voting for your own collective interests and for your own group is very pronounced for Latinos and Blacks. Two, this doesn't matter as much for Asians as it does for Blacks and Latinos. I would argue that it has to do with the persistent discrimination that Blacks have had historically, and for Latinos, it's the consistent othering and nativism and consistent anti-immigrant, anti-Latino rhetoric. Now, with regards to the immigrant-based in fate measure, I also think that one of the reasons this really matters for Blacks has to do with understanding the historical oppression of another group as well. Being that they've felt it, we're seeing it now, we've seen it in the past, and that they're also not just voting for themselves, but they're also voting for others. And that would wrap this presentation up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the participation in the chat button as well. We do have some questions coming up and also some suggestions for further reading on these topics. So we appreciate that. Okay, so now I would like to introduce our final speaker. So this is a paper that we're going to hear from Adriano Udani, who is an associate professor, also a political scientist at the University of Missouri St. Louis here, and he's also the director of the Public Policy Administration program at the university. So today he will be presenting on behalf of himself and Maria Torres Wedding, and the topic of their paper, or the title of it, is A Civically Engaged Research Approach to Ending Abusive Alternatives to Detention. So I will turn it over to Adriano.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Can you hear me, Lisa and Veronica? Is this coming in? And you see a slide? Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Lisa, and thanks to my fellow panelists and those who are here today. Also, thank you to Veronica and Cambio de Colores for just putting this panel together and finding some way to just share our work as we go through these times. So I normally study how racism influences what people think and how they think about immigration enforcement. I use a lot of survey experiments and public opinion data. This project is entirely different from what I'm accustomed to. It's really trying to make an effort to use more community-based and participatory methods in political science to understand politics and oppression and racism, similar to some of the subjects that really has fueled my research. But I am part of a larger team, and so this is the beginnings of an ongoing project with Maria, who is the director of client services at the Migrant and Immigrant Community Action Project. We have been developing an evidence-based process to partner with asylum seekers to diminish abuse in immigration enforcement. And so we've been working in partnership with Sarah John at the Interfaith Committee on Latin America, Katie Miola and Chris Walentic at St. Francis Community Services, and 20 Mexican and Central American asylum seekers in the St. Louis region. So I just want to make sure to thank them for their help and partnership in this work. So what we're mainly interested in is trying to figure out how to formulate a collective plan with asylum seekers to address policy decisions that oppress them. We think this is important because current work to improve access to social services, educating the public about atrocities that Latinos confront here in the United States is important. However, few channels have been created for asylum seekers to raise the bar of service quality, as well as abolish system-level factors that marginalize them. And so as a consequence, at least here in St. Louis, and I'm willing to bet in other places, Mexicans and Central Americans are frequently positioned only as service consumers and only as storytellers of oppression, which is harmful and can re-traumatize them if not done equitably. But also I think this squanders any opportunities to channel energy towards policies that affect them and just changing the social norms that define what equitable and quality social services are in an area. So before discussing our process, I thought it would be important just to give a brief background to asylum seeking and also the challenges that as seekers tend to face. Despite an extraordinary process of escaping violence elsewhere in the world, US immigration law requires all asylum seekers at ports of entry to be detained by ICE or held under constant supervision. Studies have shown that ICE has increasingly forcibly enrolled asylum seekers into alternative to detention programs, which are then contracted out to for-profit prison tech companies. The aim of ATD programs is to ensure that attendance at hearings happen and compliance with immigration court orders through supervision. And supervision only ends if and when the individual has successfully won their asylum case, which happens very infrequently. So I just wanted to use some administrative data to show you generally what's happening at a national level. However, caution should be taken with these data, as other advocates and centers have expressed increasing concern that the federal government and the Executive Office of Immigration Review are withholding information and not reporting all the cases and the whole picture here. Nevertheless, the backlog of cases and the average time to have your day in court has increased over time. As of July 2018, there were over 700,000 pending immigration cases, and the average wait time for an immigration hearing was over 2 years. The denial rate to asylum is also quite high. The national median is around 79%. And so Kansas City, which is indicated here by this blue bar, this is the immigration court that has jurisdiction over Missouri, is above that mark. So asylum seekers in Missouri are consistent with national trends. Most are Mexican and Central American families or single women with children living in poverty. Research also shows that asylum seekers are more socially isolated than undocumented immigrants. They have fewer family and friends here in the United States. They have encountered troubles and challenges with transportation, and also meet more challenges in managing interpersonal relationships. So asylum seeking is daunting for individuals in trauma and also with limited or no knowledge of experience with the US legal system. And so, for the sake of time, I just want to focus on 3 main challenges that we try to address. So first is that ankle monitors are used to enforce compliance, but are terribly inhumane. Ankle monitors are part of ICE's alternatives to detention programs, which is ridiculous to call it an alternative because it allows authorities to exercise disciplinary power even more freely, innervating the most trivial, routinized, basic aspects of everyday life. Second, immigration authorities have just irresponsibly misconstrued ankle monitoring as humanitarian because it's not confining individuals to a physical space. So to be sure, no asylum seeker would ever prefer detainment over electronic monitoring. However, asylum seekers are not intentionally not given and fully informed about ICE's relationship with its contractors that are collecting data on them. So ISAP stands for the Intensive Surveillance Appearance Program, and ICE contracts this program out to BI Incorporated, a for-profit prison tech company who has hired their own fleet of case managers. And so BI operates as this appendage of a larger immigration detention complex that is seeking to collect more data on human behavior for the sole purpose of preparing immigrants for deportation. And so if you're coming into ISAP without first connecting with an attorney or someone who can act in your best interest, any agreements to confidentiality with ISAP staff can be used to really undermine asylum seekers' efforts to find additional help outside of the agency. Lastly, attorneys are not allowed to speak with case managers directly via phone or accompany them with their check-ins, which is very dangerous because this information, again, is communicated to ICE. And as Maria has said before, the treatment and the advice that ICE and ISAP case managers give clients is at best paternalistic and at worst dangerous. So to address these main challenges, so we're sort of aiming for sort of micro as well as macro level changes here. We build a process that looks like this. You know, this is informed and supported by peer-reviewed research. This is sort of what we're operating here with. So there's two main entry points here to this process, which I indicated with two arrows. Studies have shown both formal and also informal services and support networks are important in the Latino community. On the formal side of things, we rely on social workers and client service managers at MICA and at St. Francis who are trained and sensitive to cross-cultural issues and interpersonal dynamics involving traumatized individuals and persons in positions of authority. But we also acknowledge that there are some asylum seekers that don't go through screening, either for personal reasons, but also perhaps the organizations can't take on new cases because they're just operating beyond capacity, which is unfortunately becoming more of the norm. But here in St. Louis, an informal channel does involve an accompaniment program run by IFCLA. IFCLA's accompaniment project seeks to train teams of volunteers to be present with immigrants during mandated check-ins with federal authorities and immigration enforcement agents. And so there's flexibility here in terms of, and partnership between screening and accompaniment between MICA, St. Francis, and IFCLA, as well as the Immigrant Service Provider Network to get asylum seekers the need that they want. But I think what is important here is that all channels lead to having this conversation to educate clients about ISAP and ICE, which others have shown is important to interrupt cycles of administrative violence. So ISAP is typically asylum seekers' first introduction to case management. It's important here to explain the relationship between ISAP and ICE, but more importantly, it's important to sort of communicate a commitment to keep asylum seekers safe. And so we discuss that we do not report to ISAP or ICE. We think it's important to explicitly reject ICE's use of ankle monitors, and as well as just express the belief that all people should be treated with dignity and respect. And so we also, however, acknowledge that we have no control over what they do, which is a difficult conversation. However, being transparent, I think, about the motives as well as the potential outcomes here and risks centers the decision-making process around the individual, which I think is absent in a lot of political science research. The individual is invited to opt out at any point when they assess the risks and costs of taking action are not personally worth it for whatever reason, and we don't necessarily judge that. Lastly, we advise people to not answer any legally significant questions with ISAP or ICE. So, for example, why did you come to the US? Are you afraid to go back? Did you have any involvement with gangs? Where is your passport? These are the answers to these questions are consequential and can be used against asylum seekers in deportation. So they are advised to say that you want to speak with your attorney before answering these questions, or to say that your attorney asks you not to answer them. But as you can imagine, it is very difficult to have these conversations in the presence of an authority figure. In addition to accompaniment, another choice of action that we provide asylum seekers is to help us learn what's happening in other places. We want to decide how we can actually stop ISAP from having these punitive requirements, and we think that the first step is really to figure out how things are similar and different in other states. And so to do this, we're getting ready to send a survey to providers that do work like MICA and St. Francis and IFCLA to learn more. And so once we receive those results, the asylum seekers as partners are going to determine the next steps and determine how that information should be shared here in the St. Louis region. In my last few minutes, I want to just sort of share some outcomes to date. And so first, we've partnered with 20 Mexican Central American asylum seekers, which is great. They've already voiced what they would like to know from other service providers. These range from questions about why is there an inconsistency in enforcing the rules to confusion of what it takes to get ankle monitors off. But before getting engaged with any more work, we think it's important to secure funding to pay asylum seekers equitably for their expertise and time. Second, we don't know what the results will get as we're handing the mic to asylum seekers to determine the path forward. but we are standing in solidarity with them, and we're there for how long ever it takes. But we don't know how long it's going to take. But if anything, I think this process helps to facilitate needed conversations between service providers and advocates here who work with asylum seekers. And I think this helps to begin to break down these silos of services that are present in our system. Lastly, I think this work aims to really correct a power imbalance between academics, community organizations, and people who are often over-researched and interrogated with questions about their own oppression. I think throughout this whole process, we emphasize the need to continually ask for consent and check in and give the decision-making power to those that are most impacted, which are the asylum seekers, which involves participating in what information is collected and ultimately owning and deciding how that data should be used by the broader community, which I think is important. And again, unfortunately, not as important in political science scholarship yet. If you would like to learn more about asylum and legal advocacy, the Immigrant Service Provision Network, Provider Network hosted a webinar at the following address. For all other questions, please reach out to me, Sarah John, and Maria Torres Wedding. So again, thank you so much for this time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. That was, everyone did great trying to stay on time. My timer is going off. So we do have about 11, 12 minutes for conversation. And I guess I'm gonna start out just with the, I'm trying to read through the chat and maybe combine some of our questions. But the first one I do wanna throw out was for the first presenter. And thinking about the policies and inclusion of Latino, Latinx seniors, you mentioned lack of trust. So one of the questions was about how does the lack of trust within a community shape policy? So if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so definitely that's a topic that needs to be addressed. We didn't do it in this project. This project actually has two parts. One, the idea was to talk to people involved directly in policy or with organizations that that serve seniors. The second part was to actually interview seniors themselves. We'll do that once we get funding, basically. but that is a strong part. Now, most organizations here in the region or here in Nebraska, in Omaha, that work with Latinos do not work with seniors. As I mentioned, the Intercultural Senior Center, it's well known for that. But most of the others work with youth, with children, with women. So there is a lack of community organizations participating in this, which it helps to, or it doesn't help on bringing this out of the silences, right? So I think that one possibility would actually to be, and this is something that we probably need to do from Oyas, is to start talking more about the relevance of thinking about policies for Latino seniors. We all for DACA, and we're extremely happy of the results of yesterday. But that's where most of the policy making or the pressures towards policy making happen here in the state, right? So it is getting the community involved and saying, hey, we agree with that. That is very important. We need to continue doing it. But there's also other issues that we need to start thinking, because they might not affect you today, but it will affect all of us in the next 50 years, right? We're all going to get old, hopefully. So we're all going to be needing this kind of policies, right?
Yeah.
So that'll be, and I agree, we need to do more in terms of reporting these results to the community, right? And that is one of the objectives at the end of the report that we're going to write, is that not only we're going to bring it back to the people that participated as interviewees, but then it comes all a process of taking it back to the community in general, presenting it towards the community in general.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think beside also thanking all the panelists, I don't think I said that, but thank you all for your work. It is great really to learn about the different perspectives and how each of you are working within communities and trying to be responsive to community needs. And I think that's really fabulous. It seemed like, especially for the middle presentation, but maybe everyone might have something to say about this. There were a couple questions about how the diversity within different groups is actually shaping the findings somehow. So when we think about the Latino elders or seniors in Nebraska or in your study, they include newcomers, but they include also longtime residents probably, right? Like the Latino community in the US, this idea of Latinx or Latino, Latina is very diverse. And then likewise in the second presentation, especially this finding about Asians, right? And differences amongst these really large categories, right? Asians versus Latinos, Latinx versus Blacks, and the kind of racialization that might even happen, I think, within one community. So how are Japanese or Japanese Americans viewed versus how Southeast Asians are viewed, or people from, you know, certain countries, different origins. So I guess the overall question is sort of, how do you all see the diversity within the groups that you've been working with affect your findings? And I don't know if Yoshira, if you want to talk a little bit about that, because a few of the questions around that idea were for your paper, and then if anyone else has anything to say.
Yes, so there is a lot of debate when examining, for instance, Latinos or Asians, right, because of the heterogeneity. But at least for this project, then I was looking at whether there is some sort of political group cohesion and how that affects their collective engagement in politics. That does not mean that I'm excluding it, but that's how I was looking at it. There was one question regarding national origin groups, and that's very true, that, for instance, Cubans tend to be viewed more conservative than other groups. And they are controlled for in the models, but they didn't seem to influence the overall findings of participation with regards to these results.
Okay, sorry, the sound sometimes for certain presenters has broken up a little bit, so I hope most people were able to catch most of what you said, but if you have any other ideas to share, to type in chat, that would be great. Does anyone else want to address, any of the other presenters want to talk about the heterogeneity, the diversity within the groups that you work with? And if not, that's fine. But yeah, Cristián, if you want to. Oh, yeah.
A couple of things addressing that theme. The basic data, the American Community Survey, the US Census, and all those data sources are not advanced enough to incorporate a vast definition of gender, even an insufficient definition of gender. They talk about sex, right? They have biological sex is what you answer. You're male or female, that's it. There might be the case if you go into the data a lot, you might find in the ACS, you can get same-sex households, but that's it. That's it. So it's difficult to, at least in the quantitative aspects, to deal with gender diversity from that perspective. Now, policy, even more, right? If they're talking about minorities in general, they're not going to make that difference. So that's what you see when you read the data. That's what it's available. That is problematic. It is something that we need to change. Yes, of course, but it's not in the data, right?
Right, I see. So you're saying that a lot of times when we do these studies, all we have are the larger categories, not necessarily the ability to dig deeper into countries of origin. Although it looked like maybe Yoshira's data could do that to some level, but then you might run into sample sizes and
right.
So qualitative work, more qualitative work,
yes,
maybe to really dig into some of that.
Exactly. And very quickly, yes, actually, the largest growth of Latinos in Nebraska in the near future is going to be second generation, not immigrant. So I completely agree with that comment. And I never meant to say that it was only first generation immigrants. In fact, there's a significant difference between seniors who've been in the U.S. for a long time and those who are just arriving in terms of their needs.
Right, right. And so that's a whole nother question that could be explored. Well, we do have a couple minutes left, so maybe we'll end with a question specific to Adriano's work. And again, others can pop in to talk about this, but do you have any best practices that you might recommend? You know, based on this work, you've really gone out of your own comfort zone to do something different in this kind of partnership work. In fact, I signed up for one of those accompaniment trainings, but it was canceled because of COVID. So now I need to reach out to Sarah John and ask her, what do I do now? Because I wanted to do that work. But do you have any ideas, you know, for people who work on similar issues, you know, interact a lot in communities with families who live in fear? Any general advice or ideas based on what you've seen and you've learned?
Sure. Unfortunately, ISAP and ankle monitoring and alternatives to detention enforcement is varied across the United States. And so I think that each location has developed their own strategy to contest the decision-making of ICE and ISAP. So right now it's sort of difficult to assess at this point what works. Having said that, I think just having access and having legal representation by an attorney, and then also just having that attorney be connected and integrating sort of health and mental health services is really important. So I think, like, in terms of just best practices for people who interact with families on a normal basis or everyday basis, I think just sort of listening and talking out sort of their assumptions of what ISAP is and ICE, and trying to pull out some of those misconceptions about what their intent is. Because again, I think, like, the perception is that this for-profit organization, this for-profit prison tech company has nothing to do with ICE, and it does. And I think just understanding how those data are being used against them could help them protect themselves, at least in terms of giving up too much information. MICA, the MICA project, and IFCLA does Know Your Rights campaigns that are conducted in English and also in Spanish. And so maybe through Cambio, we can share those resources where, people can sort of talk more specifically about what you should say if, an ICE officer is at your door, and also exploring those sort of rights that you do have.
That's a great idea. Veronica, we can look that up and share out, some maybe more information, because I think that's true, that our own work, it's up to us to also educate ourselves. What are these acronyms? Who does what? How do these things work? And I love your point that it does actually work really differently in different contexts. So you have to find out who are the advocates, who are the groups within your particular neighborhood, community, city, to figure out how you could step in and support families. So that's great. Well, I think, are we supposed to end, Veronica, at 2:30? So we're only about a minute or two over, maybe. I think we all did well. Thank you to the presenters again. Thank you also for chiming in and maybe texting and chatting back and forth with each other. I know all the presenters will be happy to answer questions beyond this particular event, so feel free to reach out, and we will be sharing this recorded webinar on the Cambio Center website. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact any of us. But muchas gracias. Thank you all. Happy Juneteenth. And you all take care in all your advocacy work everywhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you, Lisa.
Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.